So last week we had some pretty interesting guest lectures, and we're back to the regular schedule. I wanted to tack on a couple of extra slides to the end of the last lecture I gave on desktops to talk about some new research. So mostly the desktop research was done in the 70s, like we were talking about with our guests and the things that were in the video, in all the widgets video. But there has been some new work on icon selection and things like that in the last few years. So this is a paper from 2012 that looked at trying to make it more effective for users to select objects. And the basic idea is that when you have a cursor at some particular point, that the cursor, the area of things that are selected is usually only things that are directly under the point of the cursor. But there's no particular reason it needs to be just that point. And so the idea of these bubble cursors or circle cursors is that the area of things that are selected expands to include everything that's not ambiguous. So if you have a bunch of icons and you move close to an icon, say these are icons, if you move close to it, it'll become selected. And the size of the circle basically expands so that it's no ambiguity. So if you're a dead center, then it wouldn't be able to help you at all. But if your icons are far apart, then it would be more efficient to select icons using this kind of area cursor. And not too surprisingly, it turns out to be more efficient to do things this way. And the paper goes into a bunch of Fitts law analyses that help you understand why it does that. Basically, it increases the area of the target. Another old paper, or recent paper, I mean, this is from this year's CHI conference. I was kind of surprised that there's still work in this area, but this was kind of an AI system that helps you figure out what to click on, what kind of icons are in a file browser, how to find your thing. So it had 3 different techniques that they put together. One was based on your current history, what it thinks you might want to select next. So it would highlight icons. In this case, plants is its best guess, history next, and article. It would highlight whichever icons it thinks you probably want to click on to help you find things. When you put your mouse over an item, it picks the 3 most likely folders in that icon and the 3 most likely applications, 3 most likely files, 3 most likely folders that are one level down. So instead of clicking on the folder and then clicking on the thing inside, you can skip a level to the extent that it guesses right about what you wanted to do on the insides. And again, that's based on prediction, based on your recency list and stuff like that. And then another one is to help it know what you wanted to go to. You could type a few characters, so it would combine search and browsing. So unlike Spotlight that would just get you right there, this one lets you just type a few characters and then it would highlight things that are relevant to it. So, and not too surprising, so time is measured here, so lower is better. The standard case is the red line, which is the slowest, and the hover menus provided the best advantage over all these different techniques that they tried. So this is a fairly typical way of doing this analysis, where you have a bunch of ideas, but you have to evaluate them separately to see which one's the most effective. Yeah?
Does it explain why it goes up on 4?
I don't recall, sorry. I just don't remember. There's a big variance here as well, but I don't really remember, sorry. It'd be interesting to go look that up. Here's the URL if you want to check it out. Okay, so that was I just, as I was reading up for the current lecture, I found a bunch of these articles about the last lecture, so I figured I would just throw them in. So even though these lectures are called deep dive, which means that most of the research was done in the past, you still see occasional research projects in all of these areas at CHI and UIST. So the main conferences where you would expect to see this kind of research is the big ACM SIDCHI conference, which is every year in April. About 2,500 people go, and it has kind of the whole area of HCI covered. The specialty conference that has interaction techniques is generally the UIST conference, which stands for User Interface Software and Technology. The conference is in the fall, typically in October. The next conference is in Hawaii, so all my students are busily trying to get papers submitted. The deadline's in about a month, in April, March or April. So anyway, if you guys invent some cool interaction techniques in this class, you might be able to figure out a way of getting them into WIST. But probably we won't be done in time. The most likely place to submit is for CHI of 2015. So the deadline for the CHI conference would be in September. So we can, if we get some good results, you can do some studies over the summer and submit it in the fall. And the conference actually is in Seoul, Korea. So that's a pretty nice trip too. Okay, so today's topic is menus. Hopefully everybody started on the homework. How many people started on the homework? Okay. It is a 2-week homework, so it should be a little easier than last week's because you don't have to do user studies. But we gave you 2 weeks because it isn't necessarily that easy. It's due next Monday, and it's all about menus. And the basic idea is to study different kinds of menus. And so the real point of this is to kind of come with an appreciation of how much variety there are in menus, what are the different choices, how you can make menus faster or slower, or how you can deal with a really large number of objects or a very small number of items, things like that. So the goal is to analyze at least 5 different designs for menus and try and come up with an interesting comparison of the menus that you find and what the differences are and the advantages and disadvantages across a lot of different dimensions. So what do we mean by menu? So Wikipedia says a menu is a list of options or commands presented to an operator by a computer or communication system. So that includes regular things that you'd probably call a menu, but it also includes buttons. It includes radio buttons, checkboxes, what are called palettes, which is basically a fixed menu. It includes kind of other ways of choosing among a set of objects. We're not including selecting objects in a graphics editor, because that's the next lecture. We're not including selecting files in the Finder. We're not including spreadsheets, selecting cells in spreadsheets. And we're also not including text entry. So we are including function keys on the keyboard, because they're usually used as commands, but not regular typing, because there's a whole lecture on typing later. So choosing one or more of a set, it's kind of one of the fundamental operations that have always been part of operating a computer. And dating way back to the very early analyses of interaction, they've always included this. So in the Foley and Wallace list of like 4 or 5 fundamental operations, they say selecting is one of them. A button is for selecting a system-defined object such as an action to be performed. And naturally, like we said, there are hundreds of variations of menus. And the key motivation for having a menu, rather than, say, type-in of commands, is because it takes advantage of recognition rather than recall. Users, for those of you with any kind of HCI background, know that users find it much easier to read a list and recognize which option they want rather than having to remember what it's called so that they can type it in. So obviously command lines are where this all, where computers came from, where you would have to type in some kind of command. But what do you call deleting a file, right? If you see a menu item that says delete, you can say, oh, well, that's probably what I want. But if you have to type it in and all you see is a cursor, is it DEL or RM or remove? Recognition works much better. So in the homework 2, at the top of the file is a list of dimensions of different choices that you can make when you're trying to design a menu. And this is kind of the list of dimensions that I thought of and that have been written up in some of the source material, but I'm definitely very interested in you coming up with other dimensions, other types. So, don't think of this list as definitive or comprehensive. So definitely, send me an email or post on Piazza or just write it into your homework if you come up with some new dimensions besides the ones that are here. So the first choice obviously is what kind of menu it is. What's the type? And there are lots of different types. Linear or regular menus, which can be horizontal or vertical. They can be linear with scrolling. So this is one from the videotape of a scrolling menu. Most of the ones today you pull down and it scrolls, or it has a regular scroll bar on it. Menus can be hierarchical, which means you pick an item and then you get to pick another item in a submenu. Adaptive size, adaptive menus. Pie menus are where the items are in a circle instead of in a list, a linear list. On the iPhone, we have spin menus where you can flick them and they spin, and that's a different way of selecting things. I'm not sure what Android does for menus, so somebody can hopefully add those. And then we're also including menus in game consoles. So how are those done? With arrow keys and clicking and stuff like that. So another part of the taxonomy is what's in the menu. What are the contents of the menu, right? So after you've picked whether it's a fixed menu or a pop-up or whatever, then you have to say, okay, how am I going to organize the items in them? And is this kind of menu good for 2 items? Is it good for 20 items? Is it good for 200 items? Is it good for 2,000 items, right? So there are very few menus that are any good if you want to choose from 2,000 items. But often, if you go to a website for a department store or for Amazon, you can browse a set of menus to get to particular items. You don't necessarily have to search. So Amazon, isn't a particularly good. Almost everybody who goes to Amazon uses search to find their items. But if you're going to like Macy's and you want to buy a shirt, right? You don't necessarily know the name of the shirt, and so you're much more likely to browse there, which means using menus in order to get down to the item. So there are situations where you want to have a menu technique to let you browse, maybe tens or hundreds of thousands of items. Another choice is what happens to inactive menus, inactive items. Are they grayed out? Which we're pretty familiar with from the Macintosh. But if you remember from the Star, they just eliminated illegal items, right? So the Star design said you never had illegal items in the menus. So what's the advantage of graying out items instead of removing them?
Users don't get confused when the menu changes.
Right. So the menu stays the same because the items are always there. Yeah.
There's also better learnability. So the first time you go into the menu, you kind of know what other options will be available at some point.
Good. Yeah. So if I had nothing selected, all sorts of things would be grayed out. But I'd still see that they're there, and maybe that would spur me to think about how I could get them to be not grayed out. So what's an advantage of just removing things that are not valid? They're not relevant. Faster selection. So generally the time to select is a linear dependency on the distance you have to go, as we learned from Fitts' law. So if you have many fewer items, you'd have a smaller distance. What else? Somebody else. Advantage of removing items that you can't select. Yeah?
Users don't get frustrated and they can't get confused if it's available. Because, you know, if there's undo is disabled and if they're still clicking it and clicking and nothing's happening, they get frustrated. If it's just not there, it's not an option they have to make that it's not there.
Yeah, in theory, it would be less confusing to not have things there that you can't click on. Yeah?
Less decisions to make.
Right. So you pretty much have to think about each of these things here. And if you're unfamiliar with the list, then you'll be reading them all. There'd be less to decide if you don't have things to confuse you. Another one is that there are sometimes options that are almost always grayed out. They're almost never valid. And then it's kind of silly that, they're always in the way. Okay. Another big choice, and we'll go over this in depth at the end of the lecture, is how to arrange the items. So should they be alphabetical? Should they be in groups? Should they be apparently, so these are in groups, so there's undo line, some editing things, line, select all line, right? And so these are obviously grouped with these lines, and they're not in alphabetical order. If you have commands, it's kind of different than if you have content words like, fruit or, states. States are almost always arranged alphabetically. And then arranged by topic. Okay, and then there's a whole bunch of choices about how you interact with the menu. How do you get it to appear? How do you get it to disappear? How do you select items in it? Which is the specific mouse buttons or keyboard keys or whatever that you have to press. So there are some menus that are fixed on the screen, like this one on the right, over there, which is basically a palette or a list of commands that are always on the screen. It's called a fixed menu or a palette. On the Macintosh, obviously there's the fixed menu at the top of the screen all the time. Pop-up menus that pop up with a particular mouse button. So I click in the background with the right mouse button and a menu appears. We often call those context menus nowadays. There are also pop-up menus from a particular button or widget. So we saw that in the Star. They have these menu buttons all over the place, which is the only way to get menus. Nowadays, this might be called an option button that pops up a set of choices. So then the next question is, how do you interact with items in the menu after the menu has been invoked? So most menus you can press, hold, and move amongst the items and then release. There are other kinds of mechanisms where you can't move from item to item. Okay, so that's another choice. So for these menus, if I slide around, it doesn't actually work, right? I can't, whatever one I click on, I go there no matter what, right? So that's different than regular old menus, let's say, and where you can go from item to item, right? And that's also different, it turns out, from like radio buttons. So radio buttons, like here, when you press down, it highlights, and then if I move away and release, nothing happens. If I press down and move to another item and release, nothing happens. So I have to press down and release inside, and that's how you get it to operate, right? So there's a choice when you're designing a menu type of thing about whether you can move from item to item while you're interacting, while the mouse button is held down, or whether only the first one that you click can operate oops. So there are all sorts of choices about how you operate the menu items. And then some of them have the ability to operate as click, click. So you press once to invoke the menu, then you press again to actually select something. And of course, if you're using your finger on an iPad or a touch screen, there are also equivalent choices. Do you press and hold your finger, or do you flick your finger to make it scroll? Do you tap and release? Does something happen on finger down, or does it happen on finger up? So all of those are things that you have to analyze. And one of the problems I noticed as I was going through all the widgets video is that it's not always exactly apparent what the guy is doing with his mouse or whatever. And so he'll say, it was especially true in the star, you press the move key. Well, do you press and hold the move key, or do you press and release the move key? So it turns out you press and release it. But it's important in your homework when you're looking at how the users interact that you actually write down all these details so that it's clear what the differences are. Next, you have the question of what the feedback is. How does the user see what's going on? And most modern systems let you see something even if you just put the mouse on top of something without any buttons pressed. Right, so that's called hover feedback. Then you have feedback when you press down and feedback over the item that's selected. And then if there are submenus, how do those happen? Do you have to click, or do you slide out? So there are a lot of choices with that. And in many menus, there are multiple ways you can do stuff. So you can pop them up from the mouse. You can pop them up from the keyboard. After you pop them up from the mouse, you can use arrow keys and the return key to make it do something. There are all of these choices. So in Windows, you see how there's a little underline under this file, under the F. So if I hit the Alt key, then the file got highlighted, and I can use arrow keys now to move around. I could also type V, and that would jump right to the View menu because of the V is underlined. And then you'll notice that all sorts of things are underlined here. So I can type S for show, and that will jump to that icon. And so you can navigate this whole menu just by the keyboard by typing letters or arrow keys. Yeah?
Out of curiosity, is there any data on how often people actually use this and why?
When at the very beginning of Windows, there was a big antipathy towards the mouse. So everyone was used to using keyboards with DOS and the previous versions, and there was some feeling that real computer users wouldn't use a mouse because that was for the silly Macintosh. And so in the original Windows, you'll see as we get to it, or if you saw it on the videotape, that everything was keyboard driven as an option. It's certainly an interesting question how often people do that today, and if on the ribbon, like in PowerPoint, they don't have this underlining anymore, and if I hit the Alt key, they pop up all these little symbols so that you can see what the characters are, but they're not in front of you like they were in previous systems. So I don't know the answer, if there's any data on that. I would imagine Microsoft has it, but I don't know. Yeah?
Adding to this point, I think when people are actually writing notes while interacting with the computer in case of a development environment like Eclipse, I would most likely use keyboard shortcuts than going to the mouse and thinking what is that.
Yeah, so there's some good research on strategies, in particular for scrolling and navigating, on how much of a move does it have to be before you're willing to take your hands off the keyboard. So if you're typing a lot, if you're programming, and you want to go down a line or two, you're very likely to use the arrow keys. If you want to go to the caller of this function, there's a command for that. But if you're just wondering where this particular method is in the file, then you're much more likely to switch to the mouse and scroll and look for it, things like that. And so There is some research that, and it's actually pretty old now, so it might be interesting to reproduce it with modern systems to see when it's appropriate to switch from the keyboard to some other kind of scrolling or navigation technique. Okay. So that's the taxonomy I have in the homework, and we'll go over a whole bunch of examples from history and some new examples of menu items in the rest of the lecture. But as you're looking at your 5 menus or more, or looking around for some interesting kinds of menus, hopefully you'll discover some other parameters that I haven't listed, some other dimensions, some other things that differ, and you can make a note of it. Okay, so menus really go back pretty much to the beginning of computers. They've always been switches of some kind on the outside of computers. At least there's a power button. I don't think they've ever invented a computer without a power button. In the early days, you remember the video of Sketchpad. He's using this enormous array of buttons and switches. He has this button box down here. They didn't have on-screen menus in the Sketchpad system. The screen was really too little to have menus along with the graphics, and the computer was too slow. But he was using this, physical buttons as switches, and they had little pieces of paper taped to them so he could remember which ones are which. I'm not counting the knobs as menus. Those are like sliders now, but the buttons certainly were. I went back to the oldest textbook I have on my shelf on graphics, which is from the William Newman and Sproul textbook from '79. And it quotes this paper from '69 talking about a pie menu kind of technique. And these actually, he's talking about these menus in terms of light pens and pointing to the screen with the same kind of device that that's being used here, this light pen. So so there's a whole bunch of pretty old-fashioned looking kind of menus that are there. So, and these would you'd point the cursor at one of these and click the button on the side of the pen. On-screen menus, again, are pretty old. The Foley and Wallace paper that I mentioned talks about permanent menus versus pop-up menus, and menus that take over the whole screen versus ones that are put beside some other material. You can imagine that it's easier to use ones when you can see the other material at the same time. And this very old paper, which is well before the graying out idea came in to general use, says that you should definitely remove items that are not legal. So the alternative at this point, they didn't have graying out of items, so the only alternative was either to display it and let people click it and give an error message, but they recognized early that that was worse than just removing it. Okay, so now we get to the more interesting systems, and most of these were on the video. Hopefully everybody watched it, all the widgets video for menus. Markup, which was invented by Newman Sproul, Sproul when he was at Xerox. Markup is credited with the first pop-up menu, at least by '74, and it has this really bizarre way of popping up menus that when you click down, you got one row. And hopefully the item that you wanted was on that row, and if not, then you move up and down to get more rows of content. So you kind of have to fish around to see if you could find the kind of icon you wanted. And if there was some drawing behind, you could see through this menu. So these items were just drawn directly on top of the screen, so you could see through them. Fixed menus, which we might call palettes, are, as I showed in the previous previous slide date way back to the 60s. Draw used that style as well. And you can see that a variety of things are highlighted, so you're in various modes at the same time. So this is both a style palette as well as a mode palette. So this section up here, for example, is how thick a line you're doing and what shape your pen is, right? So it's a thick line or a thin line. And then this is kind of what kind of shape you're drawing, and this is the particular command that you're giving. So all of these palettes are kind of combined together. Smalltalk really took a big advantage of pop-up menus, and it was the first kind of general use of these pop-up menus that have words in them that are the kind that we're pretty much familiar with. And after Smalltalk did this, kind of everybody else at Park did it too, and that's pretty much disseminating it to the rest of the world. In Smalltalk, all the menus are pop-up, and they're press and hold menus. So you press down, move to the item you want, and release. That's how they worked in Smalltalk. And according to the video, I'm pretty sure it's right that if there's a submenu, you press and hold, you press and release on an item, and then the submenu comes up. So that it's slightly different than the pull-out menus that we have today most of the time, where you press and slide, and then press and slide, and then keep holding and sliding out. This is obviously more clicks to get to the submenus, but it's also a little more. It's a little easier to use, because the key problem with slide-out menus is that often if you go at an angle, then they disappear. So you'll notice that this one has a little hysteresis, a little bit of weight. So when I go to this item, it doesn't pop up right away. It waits a little bit. And if I go to a next item, it doesn't go away right away. It's still waiting. So that's so if I go at an angle, see, if I go really slowly, obviously it disappears. But if I go fast enough, so it's pretty natural to kind of go at an angle, since I know I want to go and pick something in this menu. And so that's another thing that you might want to investigate is, how accurate do you have to be on the submenus? So it's a lot easier if I click, and then I can click again, and then the menu will stay up, right? So the Windows menus have, all the Windows menus, most toolkits you'll see actually have 3 or 4 or 5 different ways of using them. And so these Windows menus do have this click-click approach, which can be more accurate, as opposed to trying to hold down and keep going like that. How many people knew that? Some of the Mac people, does the Mac menus work the same way? Can you do click-click as well as press and hold? Hover without pressing? Okay. Yeah, so if I just hover, I get highlighting, but I don't get the menu popping up. Does the menu pop up on the Mac?
Oh, no, I can choose a different one.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of these menus that everyone uses every day that have all these behaviors that you may not be familiar with. So it's definitely worth, going in and investigating, trying a bunch of different things and seeing all the ways that these things work that, maybe aren't the ways you normally use them anyway. One of the issues in Smalltalk was that all of the commands were on these menus, and there were a lot of commands, and so there was sometimes as many as 4 or 5 deep, these menus, and you'd kind of fill up the screen with them, and when you got to the edge, they would wrap around backwards, and it could be quite a lot of clicking or dragging in order to find everything. Before the Macintosh became popular, what everybody was using was basically windows like this, DOS commands, on the PC, or Unix, or other operating systems. CPM was another operating system at the time. There was a whole bunch of these operating systems that weren't at all graphical. And they would have, so WordStar was a very popular text editor of the time. And it has a bunch of control keys. But it also has a bunch of what are called soft buttons, or soft keys. And these were the function keys along the top of the PC keyboard. And this says, if you press F1, you get help. If you press F2, you get indent, and so forth. And so all of these, and these labels would change depending on what mode you're in. And so that's typically how you would do most of your editing with the function keys. It's kind of like on ATMs today with the little buttons, and it says, this physical button changes modes, changes what it does, and you have to look at the label in order to see what the button's going to do right now. So this was kind of the standard, and when you heard, and the Star actually used soft keys in the same way. You heard David talk about that, and this was certainly one of the things that Apple was very much trying to get away from. And so Steve Jobs hated function keys. He hated arrow keys. So the original Macintosh had neither. There were no function keys and no arrow keys on the, and the iPhone still doesn't have arrow keys on the little pop-up keyboards, which are really annoying because it's so hard to select things. But that was just one of his pet peeves, based on how ubiquitous these were and how hard they were to use and remember. So we saw a lot about the Star in previous things. I just want to focus a little bit on the menus. There were lots of command buttons, as we saw, and they had these menu buttons. There were no pop-up menus except from these buttons. And eventually the buttons got to be in more and more places, so that they put them in the property sheets eventually, where they wanted to have a bigger list of choices. You heard David talk about how they tried to get rid of these menus as much as possible by putting them on the keyboard. And so they had this bank of 8 keys. They had this bank on the other side. So this was on the left side, and this was on the right side, and this was along the top. I couldn't get a good picture of the top menus. It was hard to find. And there's at least one more over here that I'm not sure what it was. So this says center, bold, italics, underline, superscript, subscript, something else. So it had physical labels that were for text editing, but then when you weren't in text editing mode, it would do other things. And so that was what they called soft keys, that they would change meaning. So that was kind of confusing. But they were very proud of how they used this bank of menus for most of the different operations. We talked about property sheets, which nowadays we call dialog boxes, and the Star display for these look very different. Did you have a question? No. Look very different than what we're used to today. They were basically looked like buttons. And if they were a choice, one of many choice, like the size, then they'd be stuck together. But if they were separate toggles, which we now call checkboxes, then they'd be separated. So bold is a toggle, italics is a toggle, underline, and strikeout. So these are independent. You can turn each of these on and off independently, so those would be checkboxes today. Whereas this is select one of many, so these would be radio buttons or a pop-up menu or something like that. But they were all done this way in the Xerox Start. Cedar was another Xerox system that we saw last time, which was purely tiled and had no pop-ups. So that was pretty radical. They said nothing is going to pop up in Cedar. So every other system that claimed to be kind of tiled, like the Star, still had lots of pop-ups. But Cedar had no pop-ups, and so all the menus were fixed menus. But they would sometimes change content. So if you went into a different mode, then the list of menu items you had would change, and it would get bigger and smaller. Again, they didn't gray out anything. They just listed the items that you had available or not available. Another advantage of fixed menus versus pop-ups. Well, what do you think is the advantage of fixed menus versus pop-ups? Pretty straightforward. Yeah,
It's always there.
right, so?
So you don't actually have to like click, left click, right click, or whatever the function is to get it. It's just there, and you can just go over and select things.
So what's the advantage of that?
It's easier.
Easier and faster, right? So all of the things you can do are always right in front of you. You don't have to go searching around for it. And you can always just, directly click on it. And often people would memorize kind of where things were, and then, it would be really fast to just go and click right on it because you kind of know, oh, italics over here or deletes over there. The disadvantage, what's the disadvantage of fixed menus? Yeah? Space. It takes up much more space. And, you can see up here that menu, I don't know what that is, but it has 3 lines of menu items. So you can imagine, in a modern word processor with 100 choices, it would be pretty impractical to have all the menu items in front of you all the time. Okay, so now we get to the Lisa and the Macintosh, 8384, which introduced the menu bar. So what's the advantage of the menu bar putting it at the top of the screen, as opposed to like in Windows where it's at the top of a window? Somebody new? This is a real easy one. What's the advantage of having the menu bar? I'm hoping somebody new will answer this question. Yeah?
It's essentially bounded, so you've got infinite height. You can just slam the cursor to the top of the screen and it'll stop, so it makes it a pretty easy selection.
Right. So remember we talked about Fitts' law, and the difficulty of hitting a target depends on the size of the target. And bigger targets are easier to hit than smaller targets. One of the key advantages of having a menu at the top of the screen is it basically has infinite height. Right? There's still a fixed width, like the edit target is only this wide, but in terms of height, it goes on forever. Right? And so it makes it a little trickier to do the math for how to do the Fitts target size, but you can imagine it's still a lot easier than if you have to be careful about stopping. And then it's the other issue we talked about in terms of fixed menus versus pop-up menus. You always can see at least the top-level items and kind of know where to start. They introduced grayed out items. I'm pretty sure that was a Macintosh invention. I mean, a Lisa invention. I don't remember seeing that anywhere before that, but it'd definitely be useful to do a little more research and confirm that that's true. But it's certainly the place that it's most commonly attributed to. The convention of using ... for things that pop up dialog boxes for further questions was an innovation in Lisa and the Mac. And they also listed the accelerators here. This is using the Apple key, which is from Lisa, instead of the little squiggly key that they used in the Macintosh. And also there was a way of doing submenus where they had a little triangle here in the margin. Right? So all of those things, you've seen some of the similar mechanisms from Smalltalk with the arrows, but having the accelerators on here and graying them out, I think, was new. Another thing that they did was that they realized that people were getting confused because when you select something, it immediately disappears, and then you say, whoa, what did I just do? So the way that they help people understand that is in the original Lisa and Macintosh, when you released on an item, it would blink a few times so that you could still see it before the operation took effect. And so remember that they were really targeting this for novices, and so they did a whole bunch of things like that to make it really apparent what's happening. Have anybody not seen that? It was in the video, it showed that happening, so you should definitely go back and check that out. And they recommended in the Macintosh and Lisa that submenus only be one level. I'm not sure that's still true. It's certainly not true in Windows. Do you guys have applications? You probably, these days, there are too many commands to fit in one level. But the original thing said you had pull-down menus, and there should be only one level of pull-out menus. But that was the recommendation. There were a bunch of other widgets in the Macintosh and Lisa toolkits that they provided for people to use, obviously buttons. And they had this convention that the default would be surrounded by this dark border, and that's what would happen if you hit carriage return, if you hit the enter key. So that's also an innovation they had. Pop-up menus that showed the current choice. They called those pop-up menus for some reason. Nowadays we'd call those option buttons. And radio buttons with interim feedback and checkboxes, of course. HyperCard innovated or invented this idea of pull-off menus. So if you press down on a menu bar and pulled down, you could select something. But if you pulled off in this direction, then the menu would follow you. And then it would become a window that you could put anywhere. And then you could close it explicitly by clicking on the box. So that was from about 87. Does anybody know of applications today that do that? I couldn't think of anything that still use that technique, where you could pull the menus off the menu bar.
Adobe does a lot.
Does it? So you can pull off the menus? Okay.
Yeah, and they also have mostly two rows and then properties of the application on your
Okay. Yeah. So that's so the Adobe products, obviously have lots and lots of different properties that let you control, and so they make it easy to get to them this way. I included Randy Smith's ARC system. This is a different Smith than the one we had in the video. It's Randy Smith. He also worked at Xerox PARC. He built this really cute system, and he built it in Smalltalk, and it was supposed to seem very real. So they had gravity that you could turn on and off, and things would float around, and your mouse was this little hand. And so he was the first person I know of that tried to have a real 3D look. Right? If you think about all the previous systems we've looked at, right, they tried to be very clean and clear. In the Mac and the Lisa and the Star, there's decorative elements, but but they're all very flat and simple. And so with the alternate reality kit, Randy introduced this 3D look, which is surprisingly easy to do even with a monochrome screen like everybody was using at the time. So this technique, I blew these up really, really big. It's called halftoning. Does anybody not know what halftoning is? So let's try this again. Who knows what halftoning is? Okay. Who doesn't know what halftoning is? Okay. So this screen is every pixel can only be on or off. Okay. So it's called the monochrome screen, and the same as newspapers actually. But you can make something look gray by putting every other pixel on. So that'll be 50% gray. And if you put every fourth pixel on, then it's a lighter gray, right? And if you put 3/4 of the pixels on, then it's a darker gray. So it's basically trading off space for spatial resolution for color resolution. And so it really doesn't show up very well in this screenshot from the video, but when you look at the video, you can see that these look like 3D buttons. And the way he did it was by taking this area of 5 pixels and shading it really light gray, and shading this area really dark gray. And he did that by just turning on a bigger percent of the pixels. It's called halftoning. And if you take a magnifying glass and look at a newspaper or a magazine, you'll see that that's how they print, typically by putting little dots, either black and white or color ink. And so you've got pure black and pure white, but there's a lot of intermediate values in between. So that was a pretty clever idea that Randy took from printing in order to make these 3D objects on the screen. And that really inspired a whole bunch of people after that to start providing this 3D look for the buttons, because then they could look more like real buttons. But taking a step back, and we'll see a bunch of 3D buttons coming pretty soon after that. So that was 85. Also in 85, we talked about the Andrew system done over here at CMU. And they had this really bizarre menu scheme. They also wanted to do pop-up menus instead of fixed menus. And so they had this stack of menus idea where every command was in a menu, but rather than doing pull-out menus, they had stacks of menus. And so there's the window commands, expose commands, all Windows commands. So you'd pick which menu you wanted by moving left and right. And then you'd move up and down to pick which item you wanted. So one of the issues with pop-up menus is you usually don't want it to do anything if you just click the mouse and release, because people often do that by accident. So if you look at a typical context menu, it comes up with nothing selected, right? And this is, if you look at the video about Smalltalk, it actually did select something when you clicked. And so people would always be invoking something by accident. It's like, oh, what did I just do? You know, no matter where you are, almost all menus that you see today, you know, will give you a specific menu that's relevant to where you are, but it always starts with nothing selected. So if I click and release, nothing bad will happen. So in these menus, they had the same thing, but the thing you wanted to do may be far away. And so they had the idea of this, I forget what they call it, mouse hole, which if you slid into the mouse hole would bring you to the last item you selected. And so that was a way that they thought they could make it easier for people to do the same operation over and over again. So the interaction would be you'd pop it up like this, you'd slide into this hole, that would switch the menus around so that your cursor was then over the last item you picked, and then you could just release. Or you could just, you know, move around to wherever you wanted to go. So that's another thing to consider about your menu system that you're going to be evaluating is how error-prone is it, right? Because you want to make menus that are, you know, that people do what they want and don't do things they don't want to do. So another innovation was pie menus. So there's an interesting story about this. As we saw way back here in the textbook, that there was already the idea of a radial menu where things are arranged in a circle. So this is from 1969. So whatever it is, 17 years later, this group of people at University of Maryland, College Park, introduced the name pie menus for the idea of popping up a menu where things are in a circle around where the cursor is. So what are the advantages of, you know, putting things in a circle? Right. So it says that right there. You guys are, you know, could read ahead and then you would know the answers to the questions. So it's all. So typically with a pie menu, it pops up with the cursor in the center, and then all of the menu items are equal distance from where you are. And if you have a small number of items, typically pie menus will have 4 or 8 items in them, then you know, it's really easy to get to them with a simple movement. And so they measured that in 8-item menus like this one, this is 8 items, it was typically about 15% faster to select items when you kind of knew where they were. Obviously, if you're going to have to read them all in order to find them, it's pretty much no faster if it's a linear menu or a pie menu, because you're spending almost all your time in reading and thinking. But for menus, you know, nowadays, I'm sure most of you know exactly where cut is and exactly where, you know, save is, so that you can kind of just go right to it. The same idea would happen with radial menus. You'd push down and move because you kind of knew where you were going. On the video, they show all sorts of variants of different kinds of ways of having pie menus. So what happens if you have more than 8 items? Suppose you had 20 items. So what happens to a pie menu? Yeah.
Well, one option is just to make it bigger so you can fit more, but another one was that you could kind of just like slide over and it would just pop up a whole bunch of new options and you slide back to get back to your old options.
Right. So the main point is that if you take a piece of pie and you cut it in 8 slices, right? If you cut it into 20 slices, then all the slices are smaller, right? And so if you're in the center here, the slice, if you had 16 items, then the slice that would be for each item is going to be smaller right at the mouse. And so on the video, they show that their strategy for dealing with this is to make the whole menu bigger, right? And the further out I go in a pie menu, the bigger area I have, right? So if I kind of start off in the wrong direction, I have a bigger area as I get further out, and then it's easier to select the items. So if you had 20 items, you'd probably have to move further out in order to get to a reasonable size slice. Yeah?
If you extend the pie, it's kind of changing the hierarchy of information, right? You're dipping into a different layer. But I think maybe you can do the integrate the fish pie. So, like, you are selecting the atoms around the one you're finding.
Yeah, I can.
Bigger and up, like, make the graph smaller.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I don't think I've ever seen anybody implement that, but certainly it makes sense.
Yeah.
So we'll see in another one, there's this idea of fisheye views, with get it bigger and smaller. So you can imagine shrinking and expanding these as you're moving into different sections. Yeah?
Was there variant where they highlighted like the most commonly used options? Because the linear menu is the most frequently used ones on top, so you can easily find them, but when it's in a circle, it's not that easy.
I don't know if anybody has tried that. Certainly, when you have a pie menu with sub-items, another way to do this is with a hierarchy. Certainly, they try to put the most common ones at the front on the first set of menus so that you don't have to go to deep levels in order to get to sub-levels. And typically, people try to organize them in some sort of logical way that doesn't change. So you would probably start remembering which direction the common ones are. That's kind of mostly what I'm familiar with in terms of that. So it turns out that if you see the middle author on the original paper from '86 was Don Hopkins, who was an undergrad working in that lab. And he got real inspired by this idea of pie menus. He's kind of a crazy guy. And he went on to a bunch of interesting activities and eventually ended up at Maxis, the game company. And he, had always been promoting the idea of pie menus, and so he put them into SimCity and The Sims as one of the key ways of choosing things. And it turns out that these are particularly good for using with game systems that have basically a joystick, right? Because you can easily go left, right, up and down, and even diagonals with the little joysticks on your game controllers. And so to the extent that you wanted to pick one of these with a game controller, it's a lot easier than trying to do kind of a regular linear menu where you have to go up, 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 and stuff like that. So it turned out to be a really good match, and so I'm pretty sure The Sims continues to use pie menus as their key interaction. Anybody play The Sims? A few people? So pie menus still? Yeah. Do they have like multiple levels? Do some of these pop up submenus? Yeah. So, it'd be great if you could do The Sims as one of your choices in the homework to see how these continue to work in kind of the most recent version. So this is a conventional, linear menu that on some sort of control, dialog box kind of thing, and pie menus can coexist. So, sometimes the technology transition, has a lot more to do with who the people are and what they like. And, if Don hadn't gone to work for Maxis, he probably wouldn't be using pie menus in all these games today. So Bill Buxton and Gord Kurtenbach, who was a PhD student at the time with Bill, came up with this idea of marking menus, which is a very similar kind of approach, except the main idea is that you don't pop up the items right away. So like you were saying, sometimes you just know which direction things are in. And so if I made a up gesture, then it would be groceries. And I wouldn't have to necessarily wait to see the menu item if I knew exactly which one it was going to be. And in this particular 2-level menu, they have 6 items in the submenu. And if I remember that fruit and vegetables was this gesture, then I could just make that gesture really, really quickly without having to wait for the menus to pop up at all. And so it's 3.5 times faster than click, look, click again, and click again, or even doing the movements when the menus appear. And you can imagine it's also a lot faster than linear menus for the same kind of thing. So it's a pretty clever technique. It basically lets you avoid the graphical time and the think time if you know exactly where you're going. And so they put this into some of the products. They both went to work for a company called Alias, which is now part of AutoCAD, in a product called Maya. And a lot of these mechanisms are there. Yeah?
What exactly is the advantage of making the menu appear slower? Because if you know where it is, surely it doesn't matter how the menu appears if you just do the thing anyway.
Well, I think back when they started, it wasn't necessarily instantaneous to get the drawings to come up. And it obliterates some of the drawing, which you then have to replace. And the screen flickers so that it tends to attract your eye to it. But just the idea that I can drag through this item and through this item without having to click or anything, right? So normally I would have to press and release or press, to drag through to get to the submenus, but being able to do it in one gesture is faster. So, I mean, that would be an interesting experiment to see if, if it just appeared and you didn't have to worry about it, you could still just do the gesture, whether that would slow people down or not. I'm not sure whether they did that study or not. Okay. So as we mentioned before, Microsoft was big into character stuff, so they took the standard menus pretty much the same that were on the Macintosh at the time with the accelerator keys out here and arrows to show things, the menu bar, but on top of each window instead of on top of the screen, and added at least 2 different ways of invoking all the menus from the keyboard. So they retained what are called accelerator keys or control keys to do all the commands, like Control S for save and Control C for copy. But they also added these underlined things, which are called mnemonics, that that you can invoke from the Alt key. And the menus also operated in these 2 different ways: click, click, or click, or press and hold and release. So these were all built into the menu package right from the beginning. How many people used Office XP with these personalized menus? Most of you guys aren't old enough. So before the ribbon, there was something called personalized menus. So Microsoft recognized that they were getting too many items on their menus. And they were trying to think of some way of dealing with that. And the menus sometimes would be, almost the whole screen's height, because obviously people had smaller screens in these days as well. And so they had this idea of having personalized or adaptive menus that would try to only show you commands you wanted to see or you were likely to use. And so based on statistics of what you tended to use, they would show you these short menus and then have this little arrow thingy that you would click on if you wanted to see more items, some of the other items. And then it would unroll or open up, and they'd show you all the items that are in the menu. And notice that the items go in between the other items. It's not like they all tacked on at the end. So in the full menus, they're in the usual order. And so new and close had been omitted. And so they were stuck in. And then you had save and save as. And then there was this whole group that was omitted. And so they showed them, in different colors so that you could tell which are which. But you'd end up having them interspersed instead of at the end. I and most other people I know of ended up disabling these because it was really bad at guessing what you wanted. Right? So that's a problem that people always have with intelligent interfaces or AI systems, is when they're not helpful, when they do the wrong thing, they're worse than if they hadn't even tried. Right? And so anybody remember Clippy? So that was another failed attempt at Microsoft trying to help people by having an office assistant. The problem is that they had this AI system that just wasn't helpful. And it was kind of supposed to be cute. But the problem is cute and unhelpful is just annoying. Whereas cute and helpful, that might be cute. If you kind of look at the blogs of the time, I don't know if you can call them blogs back then, but they had all these news items and so forth about how to disable this. I just found 3 of them. It was pretty easy to figure out, how to turn these off, and most people ended up doing it. So that was another idea about menus. There's been a lot of work over the years on, like I said, how to organize menus and, whether it would be helpful to have the most common items at the top. Another thing that's wrong with this is the adaptive menus would change, right? So which ones are there weren't always necessarily the same. So if you were looking for the print command, sometimes it would be there and sometimes it wouldn't. And so that got to be pretty, annoying for the obvious reasons. Okay, while all this was happening in the land of PCs and Macintoshes, you guys have heard of Linux now? Linux comes from Unix, which was an operating system invented by AT&T back in the 70s, and has always been a popular operating system. It's actually behind the Macintosh. Is a version of Unix. Also, Android is a version of Unix. Meanwhile, there were a bunch of machines that specifically advertised that they were Unix machines. And these were built by Sun and Apollo and Silicon Graphics and many other vendors. And what happened was all of the software manufacturers like Adobe got really annoyed that there were all these different systems that they had to make their software run on. So if you wanted to buy a Sun, or you wanted to buy a Hewlett-Packard or an IBM, a whole bunch of companies made these things, only some software would run on it. And Adobe wanted to sell a Unix version of Photoshop, but they didn't want to have to re-implement it 8 times for the 8 different platforms. So there was enormous pressure to come up with one standard that would run on all Unix platforms. So the industry got together and formed these consortiums, but they couldn't even agree, so they came up with 2 standards. Sun and Xerox, actually, and a few other companies formed what they called the Open Look Foundation, which built this set of look and feels up here that kind of looked like the star, because they had Xerox people involved. And a bunch of other companies headed by Hewlett-Packard and DEC came up with a different standard called Motif, which was much more 3D-ish and colorful, right? So Star was black and white, so it's not too surprising that the Xerox design was kind of black and whitish. Whereas at this, remember, all these previous machines we've looked at are pretty much black and white machines. And they're just now, just in the 88 time frame, are starting to be color screens. And so people are starting to think about how to take advantage of that. So this very colorful 3D look became the actually was the one that won. So Motif was around for a while. OpenLook disappeared really quickly. Of course, Unix pretty much disappeared as a major platform, and Motif disappeared eventually as well. So anyway, the menus on OpenLook were kind of unusual. That maybe was also a problem. They had this bubble shape, and so they kind of look more like buttons than like a menu bar. And they had kind of weird behavior that if you use the middle mouse button, it would do something totally different than if you use the left mouse button. So the left mouse button would do the usual stuff, and the middle mouse button would pick some random operation and just do it. And which operation would it do? It's whichever one was circled, which was called the default operation. And how did you set that? Well, you had to do it by hand. And you could say, this is the default operation that I want to do most often. And then you could click the top button, which wouldn't tell you what it was going to be, with the middle mouse button and do that right away. That was not a particularly popular feature and didn't catch on. Yeah, and so the Motif look and feel used this design for, so radio buttons, instead of being circles with a dot, were diamonds, and checkboxes, instead of being checkboxes, were X's. Slightly different design. Like OpenLook used the star look and feel so that you had boxes either connected or disconnected. Familiar from what we've looked at already. So that's kind of, and Motif also had the 3 or 4 different kinds of accelerators, like we've seen, the mnemonics and the other accelerators as well. Okay, so that's kind of brings us to the 90s, and that was kind of the end of the videotape. So what's happened since I made the All the Widgets tape? Obviously, the Palm Pilot came out. As we talked about before, they have these 4 physical buttons, which you could actually remap to different things. And an individual application could actually take them over and not let them do the standard things, which was obviously not particularly user-friendly, but it was available. So this would be the calendar and the phone and the to-do list and memo. They also had these 4 soft buttons on the screen. And the one I've circled was actually the menu button. And this would pop up a very conventional pull-down menu system. So very much like you're familiar with from a PC, from a regular computer. And you could tap on these with your stylus and select items. So this is obviously very much dependent on using a very fine point, right? You couldn't imagine doing this with your finger. You know, you could try, because the screen is sensitive to a finger, but these targets were really too little to accurately hit with your finger. You really had to use a stylus to do it accurately. And they had other choice widgets. So this was a pop-up. These were little pop-up widgets. They obviously have on-screen buttons. Here's another kind of choice widget that was available. So it had a set of choices that were pretty much familiar from PCs. Not a lot of innovation in terms of how you would do operations or select things on these devices. I couldn't actually find much about what the Newton looked like, but I think they were pretty similar. On the iPhone, there's a lot of innovation in terms of how you actually use all the widgets. So from the start, the iPhone was finger operated and not stylus. So that meant that everything had to be bigger. And there wasn't any ability to have these tiny little targets like pop-up menus and so forth. So they were basically 2 kinds of choice things. So these were on-off switches, or checkboxes, basically, and you actually had to swipe across them. On the newest versions, you don't have to swipe anymore. They're much more stylized. They look like this, and you can just tap on them. But on the original thing, you actually had to swipe across, and that was made sure you didn't do it by accident. And then everything else was pretty much these fixed menus that would go from screen to screen. And so it was often a fairly deep menu, so you'd go to settings, and then you'd click here, and that would go off to another page, and you'd click somewhere, and it'd go off to another page, and so forth. Lots and lots of, basically, these kinds of menus. And when you had browser menus and stuff like that, it did a very clever thing. If you went to a web page that had some sort of control that was too small to operate with your finger, then it would copy that into these spin menus, right? And in the original system, they looked very much like it was actually a menu on a roller, and you could spin it. Because of the way it looked, it was kind of obvious that you could spin them because they look like rollers. And so you could pull down slowly, or you could give it a big spin if you kind of knew where you were going. They obviously also use this for time, setting times and dates and stuff like that. Made it much easier. In the current version of the operating system, they took away kind of all of the 3D look and the affordances, because they figure by now everybody knows how to do this stuff. And so they don't need all of these cues that they used to have to help you understand how to use this. And, you know, it's kind of the evolution of devices. When the Macintosh originally came out, they said, okay, we're going to make this really simple for people. There's going to be only a few commands, only a few things you can do. It got more and more complicated as people got familiar with it. Same thing with the iPhone. The original design, very simple. Everything was really designed to be very clear about how to use it. Many fewer options. And nowadays, they assume that people are more sophisticated and they want more functions. And so pretty much on every screen, if you swipe from the corner, it'll do something different, or from the sides. And all the controls are much more abstract in some sense. But, you know, it definitely had a lot more innovation in the widget sets and the way you choose menus and stuff than something like the Palm Pilot, which really very much harked back to the PC menus. I don't think there's been much of interest in the area of game controllers and consumer electronics. Obviously, you have enormous numbers of fixed controls, either on the controller or on the remote controls especially. Typically, there's a set of arrow keys and a button to use with on-screen menus. So you'd go arrow, 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 and then hit enter, something like that, in order to move on-screen menus. If anybody knows of any interesting consumer electronic menus or on-screen menus, that would be useful to do. Anybody know of anything off the top of their head? Of course, the Wii has a two-dimensional pointing device. The controller actually detects where you're pointing at the screen. And so you can actually have kind of regular mouse-style menus on the screen where you can point to things directly. But because it's relatively inaccurate, they're enormous. So it doesn't really help that much. You could still use the arrow keys to get around. If you've ever tried to actually look at the data coming out of the Wii controller, the cursor is wiggling around all over the place. It's like 10 or 15 pixels of wiggle. So it's really not very accurate. Okay. And there's a variety of newer things that are pretty standard. There's the Ribbon from Microsoft, which came out in 2007, which has a fairly different set of behaviors. So when you click on them, you get different ones, and there's a way to make it roll up by double-clicking. Gets it out of the way if you don't want them there. You can directly click on some of these things. Have pop-ups that come with them. And in theory, you can remember where things are and find them easier. I find it really annoying. But that's where we are with them. And then Macintosh has the dock, which is kind of like the Windows taskbar, but I couldn't find anything about when they got bigger and smaller, whether they did that from the original stock or whether that came in later. Anybody know?
I think it was an original feature.
In the original version of the dock? Okay.
I think so.
Most of the pictures on the web have it turned off. So
I
that,
think it was an optional feature.
Okay.
It wasn't turned on by default.
okay.
I'm pretty sure it was there.
Okay. So that would be something to look up. Anybody think of any other kind of menu-like stuff on new systems? Yeah?
Is it not on Windows 7 when you have like 3 Word documents open and cover the taskbar and the form is open?
Oh, yeah. That's kind of cute. Yeah, so preview of what you're going to see as you hover over them sometimes works. And then you can go up and if you move into the previews, then you can actually use them to pick. Okay.
I don't know, it's sort of the expose style task switching. It's kind of like a
Mhm.
Franken menu icon.
Yeah, so there's a long history of, like last time we talked about the rooms, a metaphor where you could have different sets of screens. So expose is kind of a better designed version of that where you can kind of have whole different screens that you choose from. Okay, well, we went a little over. I thought this was going to be way too long, so next lecture is actually a little short. So we'll finish up the menu stuff on Wednesday. And don't forget to be working on your homework. By the way, unfortunately, the TA, Jeff, had to go out of town suddenly for personal reasons. We wanted to have the homeworks back today, but unfortunately, we are not finished yet. So sorry about that. Everybody's doing really well. Most of the people are getting really excellent grades, so you don't have to worry about it.